welcome back to Strayatrains. Since its construction, the City Loop has played an integral part in the operation of Melbourne's electrified passenger network. While certain individual loops have been shut, this unique 2-week shutdown of the entire City Loop from 9 p.m. Monday the 2nd of January 2023 to Sunday the 15th of January has solidified the importance of the City Loop. In this video, we are briefly going to look at the operational benefits of the City Loop and focus on the uniqueness and surprises from the service alterations over these two rather interesting weeks. Hope you enjoy the video.
This is a service to
Strayatrains,
stopping all stations direct to
Strayatrains. Let's start off with the highest numbered operational platform at Flinders Street and then work our way down, starting off at platform 13 with the Sandringham line. Oddly enough, during this City Loop closure, the Sandringham line was one of the few lines that actually benefited from the closure. Because the Frankston line was down due to works between the city and Moorabbin, Frankston line passengers travelling to Moorabbin Station and onwards were actually advised to take a Sandringham-bound train to Brighton Beach, and then at Brighton Beach take the bus replacement connection, which was direct from Brighton Beach to Moorabbin, and then to change at Moorabbin Station for a stops all Frankston train service. Because of the extra patronage, Metro ran Sandringham trains off-peak at a 10-minute frequency instead of the typical 15 minutes, and then during peak at an even more frequent rate. Let's take a look here at Richmond Station with the next train 2, with most not having a time. Now let's take a look at the cross-city group platforms at Flinders Street, which are typically platforms 8, 9 and 10. Being that the Frankston line was down, Williamstown and Werribee lines were the only ones operating of this group. Platform 8 typically saw Williamstown trains depart off-peak, with Werribee Limited Express trains departing from platform 9, and then Laverton stops all from platform 10. However, what was maybe the most interesting aspect of the cross-city group during this period was the exact trains they used in operation. For the Moorabbin to Frankston shuttle trains, it appeared only Extrapolis trains operated, whereas for the Werribee and Williamstown services, only Comenge and Siemens operated, which meant on the Werribee and Williamstown lines, it felt like a little bit of throwback before the Extrapolis trains were introduced on these lines. Let's take a look at platforms 6 and 7 at Flinders Street, typically served by the Dandenong group lines being the Pakenham and Cranbourne lines. Also due to works, the Pakenham and Cranbourne lines were not operating between the city and Dandenong, meaning for a rather large period there was no high-capacity metro trains operating at Flinders Street Station. Passengers were recommended to take a train to Burnley and then bus from Burnley direct to Dandenong and then switch for a train at Dandenong to their respective destinations, which meant that Dandenong customers would have to use an Extrapolis train from Flinders Street to Burnley, which is probably something they don't do too often. If you were looking to travel before Dandenong Station, you could take a stops all bus replacement from Federation Square. Typically, Dandenong trains run from Southern Cross to Flinders Street all day. And if you have noticed throughout this video, well done. Here is a comment on the Dandenong group tracks running from Flinders Street in the opposite direction to Southern Cross, creating one of the interesting oddities that occurred during this City Loop closure. We'll look at why this happened in a moment, but first let's take a look at the benefits that the City Loop has. One benefit of the City Loop is when there are delays, sometimes Metro will run direct services to and from Flinders Street, either from North Melbourne to Flinders Street or Richmond to Flinders Street and vice versa, saving roughly 10 minutes of delays as the train skips going around the City Loop. With no City Loop available and all trains running direct, Metro cannot do this, meaning if a train's delayed, it's very hard to make up some time, without of course cancelling services. Another benefit of the City Loop is passenger convenience. For instance, if you're looking to travel towards Dandenong and you're at Parliament in the afternoon, it is actually worth your time to go to Parliament Platform 4, take the next Burnley Group train to Richmond, then change at Richmond for your Dandenong-bound train, saving roughly 10 minutes going around the City Loop. Again, with the City Loop down, you can't do this. Another benefit, of course, is the 3 City Loop stations are typically 3 of the top 10 busiest stations across the network, meaning the City Loop closing merely as an inconvenience for passengers that directly use this station actually makes a big difference. Next up, the Burnley group we'll take a look at, which is where we see Belgrove trains off peak depart platform 2, Lilydale platform 3, and Glen Waverley trains platform 4. Just about every service was or stops all except East Richmond for the Belgrave and Lilydale trains, with the exception of a few limited express services. The Glen Waverley trains departed at a 10-minute frequency up in from the usual 15-minute frequency, meaning the Glen Waverley line was one of the lines to benefit from this closure, and that was because of the extra patronage needed to get off at Burnley to switch for a bus replacement to Dandenong. Part of the changes was, of course, meaning we got some unique PIDs, such as the typical Royal Bark Limited Express service, which departs platform 2 at Flinders Street at 5:13, ended up becoming a 5:14 stops all to Moorbark except East Richmond. And don't worry, I didn't forget about the Alamein line. That was just bus replacements during this period, unfortunately. In terms of the Clifton Hill group from platform 1 at Flinders Street, the Hurstbridge line was replaced by buses between Clifton Hill and Heidelberg, whereas the Mernda line was running very similar to a normal timetable. Of course, the only major difference was these trains did not run via the City Loop to their suburban destinations. Now let's head to the most interesting aspect of the City Loop closure, and that was the operation of the Northern Group. Platform 6 and 7 saw Sunbury, Water Gardens and Craigieburn trains depart, which was an interesting throwback as typically high-capacity metro trains are the only trains scheduled to depart from these platforms now. So yes, this is exactly why just before we saw a Comenge running in the opposite to the typical direction on the Dandenong tracks from Flinders Street to Southern Cross, as this Comenge would have departed platform 6 or 7 at Flinders Street and then ran to Southern Cross on a Northern Group service. With platforms 1, 2, 3 and 4 all being served by Extrapolis trains, and no Extrapolis trains operating on the Cross City Group or no HMTs operating on the Dandenong Group here, as no Dandenong trains departed Flinders Street during this period. During this period, that meant that from platforms 6 and above, only Comenge and Siemens trains departed and arrived at Flinders Street, making a rather weird throwback to many years ago on the network, which was really just so cool to see. It really felt odd, but it was no doubt very satisfying. And yes, this is what I mean by satisfying. If you got really lucky, you could see a number of just Comenge or just Siemens at these platforms. Anyway, yes, I haven't talked about the Upfield line. We'll get to that in a moment, but let's head to Southern Cross because that station also had some interesting aspects to it during this time. Now let's head to the Upfield line operation at Southern Cross Station. Because no Burnley or Clifton Hill trains were operating through the City Loop, that meant that platforms 9 and 10 were both free at Southern Cross Station during this time. And due to congestion purposes, Upfield trains could not be scheduled to run to Flinders Street because there weren't enough tracks on the viaduct. As a solution, Metro decided to run Upfield trains terminating at Southern Cross platforms 10 during this period. As you can see by that blue stripe across the Southern Cross platform 10 sign, typically Burnley Group trains operate from this platform 10 at Southern Cross, which is usually only Extrapolis trains. However, because it was the Upfield line utilising platform 10, we got to see a throwback to some Commerce trains that used to use platform 10 a number of years ago, and for an oddity and a half, Siemens trains, which is just weird. So that meant if you were an Upfield line passenger and you wanted to travel to Flinders Street, it would actually take you 2 trains to get to the busiest station on the network. Here is an Upfield bound train using the points to divert from the Burnley Loop tracks to the tracks that will head towards North Melbourne Station. Personally, I'm not sure how often these points are used to divert trains from Southern Cross Platform 10 towards North Melbourne, but I would assume that these points aren't used too often. Now, hopefully you're not too sick yet of the Northern Group. Let's take a look now at how the Craigieburn and Sunbury trains operated at Southern Cross Station. Effectively, up Craigieburn Sunbury Water Gardens trains used platform 11 at Southern Cross, which is the typical Northern Group platforms. However, trains towards Water Gardens Sunbury and Craigieburn used platform 12 at Southern Cross, which is the typical Dandenong Group tracks, reiterating how the trains were running in the opposite direction to the typical Dandenong Group lines on this track. Also note how 328M had one of its lights not working there. Similar to what we saw just before, here is the train diverting from the Caulfield Loop track onto the track that heads towards North Melbourne Station, which is in the direction of Sunbury Water Gardens and Craigieburn. So there you have it. After a fascinating couple of weeks on the network, no doubt many questions arise, such as, will we ever see a train run in the opposite direction to the typical Dandenong Group tracks again? Will we ever see only Comenge and Siemens on the Werribee and Williamstown lines again? Will we ever see a comm engine Siemens on platform 10 at Southern Cross again in service? Well, these are some of the questions we'll just never know, and only the future will, I guess, dictate. But that now leaves one final message, and that is you never know what you're going to see in the future. So if you are interested in railways, I highly recommend you just snap up anything that you think is rare or cool, because you just never know if you're going to see it again. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this unique operation across the network during this rather odd time. And I think we'll leave it at that. Cheers.